We're now joined by Dr. Jacobus Yakisilis. He's the Executive Director for the Institute of Security Studies here in Pretoria in South Africa. And thank you for joining us today, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
First of all, we just want to understand the role of research institutes in development in politics and security and so forth in the African continent. If you can just start off, just look at research institutes in general. What is their role?
Well, we're a think tank, so our function is to try and help with evidence-based policies. So we undertake research. In our case, we also do capacity building, teaching and training, and we fill the gap between academia, universities, and governments and civil society, the three sectors in society. So we try and undertake research that is evidence-based, that can forward the African agenda. We're an African-based organization, the ISS, so we're more Pan-African than most others. So we don't follow a particular South African approach where we look at South African issues. We really look at continental issues. So over the years, we've done significant work with the Organization of African Unity, the Africa Union, various regional economic communities. But I think research institutes are hugely important in the future of Africa. African governments often have limited capacity, and research institutes can bring that additional analysis, evidence-based work to the fore to try and help in the process of policy formulation, in teaching and training, and in capacity building.
And then also, you spoke about that you also work with academic institutions. Is there then no competition between research institutes and academic institutions, universities, for instance?
Not really. Academia does basic research. We try and apply the research to the policy environment. So we are, everything that we do needs to have a policy impact. It needs to make a difference in the real world, and that is quite different to universities. Their primary function is to teach and to train, to educate. Okay. So they push out degrees and masters and PhDs, and our job is really to take people that that are well qualified, that have in actual fact served, for example, in government or in research institutes elsewhere, and to bring them and to apply their knowledge for the good of the continent.
But then they must actually hold PhDs, for instance, or master's degree.
Minimum is a master's degree. We employ Africans from, I think, 17 African countries at the Institute. We run an internship program, particularly for young black French-speaking female students.
Why French specifically?
The think tank community is much more of an Anglophone established tradition than it is in a Francophone established tradition, and that's really where the capacity gap is. And also we have a slightly more selfish purpose, and that is that the ISS, which is a continental organization, we're weak in Francophone Africa, so we try and build our relationships by working particularly from our Dakar office into Francophone West and Central Africa.
Okay, now we see also that you co-founded the Institute in 1990, so I'm guessing you must have been an undergrad at that time because you're still very young. So what was the thinking behind when you actually started this institution?
The ISS is a product of the South African transition, and we were initially, I was in actual fact in the military before I established the Institute. I resigned for political reasons. I became involved in the liberation struggle. I met up with Chris Hani in Lusaka, and the ISS came out of efforts to take the armed forces in South Africa forward. So in the first 4 or 5 years of our life, our name was different. We were the Institute for Defence Policy, and we facilitated between MK, Mkhonto we Sizwe, the so-called TBVC armies, the SADF, the KwaZulu, the armed forces, or whatever you want to call them, of the Inkatha Freedom Party, and we tried to create a vision for a future of a South Africa where the armed forces will not be a threat to democracy. And then as the negotiations in South Africa as the armed forces started talking to themselves directly in about 1993, it was much later during the settlement process, we became more regionally engaged and over time changed our mandate from a South African-based organization to one that has a continental reach and that sees ourselves as a continental organization.
But at the time when you started, you were not a doctor, I assume.
No, I was. No, I got my PhD in 1986.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No, I'm long in the tooth.
All right.
So now you went more broader than South Africa to the region, SADC, and into the African continent. So now, specifically talking right now, we have conflict areas in the continent. Are you only just specifically looking at conflict areas because the name Institute for Security Studies? Then you think security, conflict.
Yeah.
Are you just specifically focused on conflict?
We deal with a broad understanding of human security. Our name creates sometimes problems. You know, people say, do you train security guards? Are you an intelligence organization? We deal with human security. Human security, the simple way of describing human security, it is the future of your children. It is a long, secure environment for your children. And that means they need good governance, they need good educational institutions, low corruption, and so on. So human security is a broad concept that overlaps with human development. So we don't only look at where there is instability and violence, we also look at the drivers of resilience as much as we look at the drivers of fragility and what is required to take Africa forward.
Now also just specifically looking at your vision, because I saw there you have good governance and so forth. You can just take us through those as well, and then how actually you would want to enhance the African continent using specifically your areas of expertise.
The ISS, our mission is to advance, our slogan is Knowledge Empowers Africa, and our work really relates around sort of 4 inter-office divisions that work on issues that range from good governance and corruption to conflict prevention, conflict management, transnational threats and international crime, conflict management, and so on and so forth. I have, for the last 3-4 years at the Institute, been looking at the long-term future of Africa. So I head a small little section at the Institute that looks at what we call the African Futures and Innovation section. I've been at the Institute for many years, and like many of our African leaders, it's time for me to move on. So at the end of this year, I'll be stepping down, and already the Institute is under, in a sense, new management. And Anton du Plessis, who's the current managing director, will take over from me and take the organization forward. So the ISS works in 4-year plans. We are at the moment rolling out the development of our next 4-year strategy from 2016 to 2020. And the focus areas will remain more or less the same. So, but different to most other so-called think tanks, we also undertake evidence-based research, we undertake teaching and training, and we undertake capacity building. So we have memorandums of understanding with the African Union, with IGAD, with ECOWAS, and a variety of intergovernmental organizations. And we've been quite active in helping the African Union in developing many of the components of the African peace and security architecture, as well as, for example, in ECOWAS, developing their counterterrorism strategy, their maritime strategy. So we play a difficult role of trying to provide independent, objective research, but then applying that. Africa has such a capacity challenge. You can't just sit on the sidelines and comment and criticize. You need to also help, and that's what we try and do through our capacity building efforts.
But then I also guess that also this requires a lot of funding as well, because you do a lot of research, you're also assisting a lot of regional bodies as well, you speak about ECOWAS as well. So but where do you get your funding?
Our money mostly comes from European partners. Unfortunately, the tradition of African philanthropy is not well established. We have for years tried to get African governments to fund us. Now there is organizations like the African Capacity Building Foundation in Harare and others who do fund selected think tanks, but the tradition of funding independent work in Africa is not well established. Whereas in the old rich world, if I can use that term, it is well established. So you have people like George Soros and others who give significant amount of money to the kind of work that we do, which is to create the space for a diversity of thought and the conditions for what they refer to as an open society. So, of course, the nature of our work, we are independently audited. Exactly where we get our money from is available on our website. But it's mostly the Scandinavian countries, it's international partners like the Soros Foundation. We have a budget of about 140, 150 million rand. We have a staff of about 120 across our 4 offices.
Where are offices in?
We have offices in Pretoria, where our head offices, in Nairobi, in Kenya, in Addis Ababa, obviously for the Africa Union, and in Dakar, Senegal. So those are our 4 regional offices, but from those offices we work probably in about 17, 18 African countries in terms of our partnerships and researchers, field research on the ground.
All right, so now let's just now specifically look into the recent conflicts which are actually taking place in Africa. You have Burundi as well. So how does your research institute come into play in those conflict areas, maybe trying to solve?
We're not a facilitation organization. Okay. We do not involve ourselves in trying to facilitate. We provide sometimes backstopping, sometimes information and analysis that feeds into understanding what's happening and dealing with the root causes. Typically, our recommendations and our efforts would typically be provided to the Peace and Security Council of the Africa Union, generally to governments, to civil society, to partners, to donors and others. So that's the space that we occupy. We also have a training center in Addis Ababa that provides training, provides ongoing courses on various aspects of human security as part of our efforts to build African capacity.
And then also conflict resolution, because I think most of the time we're always focusing on conflict, but then the after effects, once the conflict, we're done with conflict, what happens afterwards?
I hesitate because it's a complicated question. There is the theory that you have post-conflict countries, but almost the whole of Africa, we have cycles of instability and conflict. The main challenge in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is a governance deficit. The main challenge in North Africa and the Middle East is basically a democratic deficit. I'm simplifying lots of work that we've done. If you look at conflict trends on the continent as a whole, conflict and instability in Africa peaked in 1989 at the time of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Basically, the West and the East were fighting their wars in Africa, particularly in the Horn of Africa and in Angola and regions. And that pushed instability in the continent up. But after that, instability came down very dramatically until about 2010. Then since 2014, we've seen an increase in instability in Africa. Not yet up to the levels that we saw in 1989. But there's an increase. And this is driven by a variety of factors, international terrorism and so on. But it is also driven by by our population. A younger population is inherently, and Africa has got a youth bulge, is inherently more difficult to manage. But also the transitions to democracy, which we are seeing very strongly in Africa, are inherently unstable. Many African regimes are what we refer to as anocracies. They're neither democratic nor are they completely autocratic. And these are unstable regime types. So the change from one to the other is unstable. The result of this is that there is a lot of violence around elections in Africa at the moment, which, strangely enough, is a very positive sign.
Why is a positive sign in this?
It shows that the competition is now around the electoral process. It's no longer around controlling a rural area, trying to control the eastern side of the DRC or whatever, but it's really around that elections have become the main source to power. And the struggle around the election in Africa is a struggle really to control the state. But it shows the extent to which democratization in Africa has become institutionalized. And it's really a good news story. Now, there is violence and development go hand in hand. They are not, it's not that we will reduce violence or we will eliminate violence and then we will develop. If you look at the history of the world, as countries develop, it is inherently an unstable, unequal process. This is where Africa is. It is the most rapidly developing region in the world. Our forecasts on growth rates on Africa on average about 6% for the next 20, 30 years. 6% on average for 55 African countries. It's amazing. It's not enough, but it is really positive. So the structural conditions of growth in Africa have changed completely to what it was until about 1985. Africa is on a positive trajectory, but that is not going to be a stable, easy trajectory. It is a trajectory of all kinds of problems. I always make the analogy that Africa will develop much more like India, if you want a mental picture, than from China. You know, Chinese development, in our understanding, is top-down, very simple, very organized, a bit autocratic. Indian development is from the bottom up, chaotic, corrupt. It's almost despite the state, but it happens because of the ingenuity and the resilience of the Indian people. That is the general picture of Africa's development, because we have a significant governance deficit on the continent, and that is most of our efforts, of all the Friends of Africa, really should be to build the thickness of governance in Africa, because it is the inadequacy of governance that is the easiest to fix, and that creates the problems on the continent.
And then also you spoke about violence and development going hand in hand. But what I'm interested in now is it because there's a scramble for resources?
No, it is inherent in the development process. There is, let me not say no so easily. There is a scramble for resources. There is a scramble for Africa's resources. But we all know that the commodity boom is behind us. Yet Africa still grows. Why is Africa growing? Africa grows because of the urbanization, its population growth, better governance, industrialization, the fact that we have a massive consumer market in Africa. That is why Africa is growing. The structural conditions for growth. It is the next low-wage region. It's the next market for India, because the next commodity boom will come from India's growth. So Africa is very well placed, and South Africa is very well placed in Africa, although we have problems, because we are next door to the region that is going to develop and grow the fastest in the world. So a great boon to South African industry and to South Africa business.
And also looking into South Africa now, South Africa's own foreign policy, especially in relation to solving problems in Africa. Sometimes you have academics and commentators really coming hard on South Africa's foreign policy that it's not clear. We talk about diplomacy of Ubuntu at times, and does this pose a challenge for South Africans to have a clear understanding exactly what is our foreign policy?
South African foreign policy has gone through various shifts and turns under our last three presidents. There's no doubt about that. The expectations on South Africa are very high. And South Africa will always have problems in its foreign policy because we are a big economy. We are in Southern Africa the biggest economy, and South Africans sometimes tend to take quite a forward-leaning approach in terms of when we want our way. So there's no doubt that South Africa has many critics and many challenges, but generally and that the expectations are high, absolutely no doubt. But generally South Africa is respected, it is welcomed on the continent. What we find interesting is that South African business is particularly welcome in much of the rest of Africa. But I think that what is a sense of concern is that many Africans feel that South Africa has prioritized the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, above the continent, and that we don't stand for the values that are enshrined in our constitution always. We seem to be a little bit selective. You know, it's a difficult challenge because you have to manage stability at the same time, and when there's a choice between standing for values on human rights and democracy and stability, then very often the response is let's go for stability. This is not only the situation in South Africa, it is the common African response. And we, as a values-based organization that argue in favor of governance and human rights and so on, are sometimes quite critical of that. But I also understand the challenges that South Africa has. The rest of Africa looks to South Africa for leadership, for resources, as an example, and therefore the xenophobic riots that we've had recently have done South Africa damage. The best thing that South Africa can do for Africa is to grow, and to grow rapidly, because we also serve as a locomotive for the rest of the region.
And then also there are the arguments. They're saying that South Africa goes into these countries that have conflicts to solve them, that South Africa pumps its resources to solve the crisis. But then once now the business deals come in, that they also, these deals now don't go to South Africa, but these countries actually give these business deals to other countries outside of the continent and not even give them to South Africa. Is this a fair comment?
I don't think, I don't think it is fair, because it's changing, but there's been South African business and South African government have not been acting as one. In actual fact, most South African business will say, we wish we could get some South African government support, and that South African government will open the door to us. But often often the two are not in sync. It is changing to a limited extent, but I don't think it is an accurate description at the moment of South African foreign policy to say that it changes, it opens the door to business. I think that what is of concern is significant speculation and concern on the continent that particular private interests drive our foreign policy. Much of that is wrong. But it came to the fore in the Central African Republic, it comes to the fore in the DRC and so on. It is ill-informed and I think wrong, but there's a perception that perceived levels of well-connected individuals doing very well in South Africa, that this is also influencing our foreign policy. I think this is very dangerous. I think it is wrong and I think it is uninformed, but it is quite a strong perception in the rest of the continent.
And then also now you spoke about South African government and South African business not working in sync. So what seems to be the challenge there? Because this is not something new, of course. We do see it sometimes where it's like business does not trust the government. So therefore now we don't become this one nation that's saying that this is what we're doing as a country, government, civil society, and business. So where do we see the problems, or the messaging? Is a problem with messaging?
It's more than messaging. The statement is often made that foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. The South African inclusive rainbow settlement, the pact that we reached during 1990 to 1994, is coming apart in South Africa. Business, civil society, labor are not speaking the same language. We have a divided country, a country that is unhappy with itself. That's reflected in our daily newspapers. Our newspapers in South Africa are so negative, and that reflects in how we are perceived. And it also, if those actors are not working together in South Africa, and they are not, they are not working together in our foreign policy. So we have to fix things at home. I think that will impact upon how we are perceived. But South Africans are perceived to not be playing. They may each be playing a tune, but they're not playing they're not playing according to the same sheet of music.
All right. Now into Agenda 2063, we know this great vision of the African Union. So, and then how then are we, just as normal citizens of this continent, contribute to this Agenda 2063? Maybe let's first unpack Agenda 2063. Is it feasible? Would we get to 2063 and then we have this prosperous, peaceful Africa by that time?
I do long-term forecasting.
Okay.
So we use all kinds of very sophisticated computer-assisted forecasting systems to look at where the world is going and where Africa is going in the world. Africa is rising. The prospects for Africa are positive. It is the destination of hope. But Africa will generally, in this century, remain relatively marginal globally. This century is the century of India and of China, but not yet of Africa, because we are 55 very divided countries. I think that Agenda 2063 is hugely important for the continent to set a vision, but it is a vision of where we want to go, and I think it sets ambitious targets of integration and peace and stability. The world can change very rapidly. Our job, if you look ahead 50 years to 2063, it's a very long term really to have a realistic vision, but I think it's very important to create that where we want to strive to. But I think there's a lot of work that lies ahead. We've done forecasts out to 2063 on poverty levels in Africa, on conflict levels, a variety of issues, and certainly it's all positive, but it is not fast enough. So Agenda 2063 is a broad framework, a broad vision. I think it's very important. But we mustn't underestimate the amounts of hard work that will be required to achieve that vision.
We've had our own government here in South Africa saying that we have, if you're looking at our own national interests, that already we have aligned ourselves to that vision, looking at our national development plan. Now looking to other countries as well, can they also do the same like how South Africa is doing? Or should those countries also be doing the same thing and say, okay, let us align our own national interests to that of this bigger vision?
You know, the National Development Plan precedes Agenda 2063, and I think South Africa, argues that it is in line with Agenda 2063, but Agenda 2063 was developed after the National Development Plan. And I think most African countries aspire to the same: alleviation of poverty, improvements in governance, industrialization, build investment in better education, sanitation, water. All of us. So, yes, we are all aligned. But many African countries have their own vision. Namibia, Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, many leading African countries have their own long-term visions. They call different, they have different horizons, but it is a growing trend, which is very positive, because we need to look long-term to understand what are the investments we need to make today. You know, South Africa is investing heavily in education, but it takes a generation for that investment to pay off, because kids have to go through the whole schooling system before they become productive adults that can participate in the economy. But if you can model, if you can say what is the advantage of investing R1 trillion in education at the moment, the advantage in 20 years' time, you need to be able to sort of quantify that, and that I think is hugely important. So we need a clear direction. Agenda 2063 provides that vision, but the building blocks of Africa still remains nation states, and most of the work needs to be done. The challenge always with the Africa Union has been to translate the visions into national level implementation. That is also the challenge with Agenda 2063, but it serves to inspire and to bring us together to face in a common direction. And it's particularly important around issues like governance, democracy, human rights, where it sets common standards that African leaders can aspire to.
What I like, also, you're always talking about governance in Africa. If you can also just unpack that part as well as a challenge to this vision as well, and also what governments can also do to improve their systems of governance in their respective countries. Does the African Union have a plan in place to maybe help these African countries who still battle with governance?
It is a national responsibility. We need, how do governments get capacity? Governments get capacity by having taxpayers that pay tax, that are citizens, that invest, and because they pay tax, they translate into building capacity. Building African governance capacity will come from there rather than from the Africa Union downward. The Africa Union is very good at norm setting. It sets norms and directions and values and principles. That's important. But to achieve that, so it provides peer pressure. But the implementation mechanisms really lie at the national level, and the growth of Africa will come from its countries rather than from the Africa Union setting out policies and plans. And it is through the dynamism of ordinary Africans that the continent will and is growing. So let's just have that balance in terms of where, whose responsibility it ultimately is. And in today's interconnected world, I think Africans aspire to a lifestyle and a freedom that I think makes it very difficult sometimes for governments to control their territory. Governance today is much more difficult than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And part of our,
Why is it more difficult now?
Because in this interconnected world, let's take practical examples, and that is terrorism on the continent. It becomes a copycat operation. You can see the media attention that beheadings and other atrocities get, and then suddenly you find it pops up somewhere else. Not because there's some plan behind it, but the terrorists see what is the media and the attention that it gets. And citizens see the pressure that they can exercise on governments not to stand for a third term. They feel empowered by what's happening elsewhere. And in these urban areas that are absolutely growing massively in Nigeria and Kenya, and through urbanization and urban population growth, where there's very limited job opportunities, very limited infrastructure, with lots of young people, and particularly young men, that's where the majority of crime and violence comes from. These are hotbeds for instability and violence, and very difficult to manage. People are impatient because they can see on their cell phone, on their tablet, what others have, and they aspire to visions that sometimes are not realistic, but they demand it now. And so this interconnected world is great, but wow, it's difficult to manage.
Mm-hmm. And also, you just touched on terror as well. So, and how recent of a phenomenon is terror in the African continent? And then also, are we ready to deal with this phenomenon? Because we see Boko Haram in Nigeria, we also see in East Africa as well, which is quite difficult. I think the continent is actually faced with a big challenge here. But if you could just take us back, when did we see the cropping up of these terror groups in the continent?
I'd make a distinction between so-called international terrorism and the ordinary definition of terrorism. Terrorism is the use of criminal violence to achieve political ends. That's the standard definition of terrorism. If that is your standard definition, Africa is the most terrorist-afflicted continent in the world and has been that for a century. Okay. Whether you want to refer to colonialism, whichever example you want to use. But most of the world at the moment is concentrated on what we refer to as international terrorism. That is terrorism that affects sometimes the West generally, but that has an international dimension. That is a relatively new phenomena in Africa. And the great fear is that Africa is a very religious continent. 8 out of 10 Africans believe that religion is either important or very important for the continent. We are generally as religious as Pakistan, the entire continent. So you have the potential that religion can be used as an instrument to mobilize. And because you have the high levels of poverty and inequality that you have in Africa, it's a tinderbox.
That's what we see in the CAR.
Yes, but yet, despite those structural conditions, we've not seen the growth of international terror that one would expect. In actual fact, in our studies, it shows that international terrorism in Iraq and the Middle East has really grown. Terrorism in Africa has also grown, but not at the same rate. And we really need to work very hard. Africans are more tolerant. Religion, although it's a highly religious continent, the nature of the religion that is sometimes not as fundamentalist as it is elsewhere. So great potential. We need to watch the space. But Boko Haram, there are many historical reasons, for example, for Boko Haram, but it is largely because of poor governance why the problem has become a violent terrorist problem over the last 20 years. But it's been there. It's the result of 50, 60, 70 years of poor governance in Nigeria. Why Boko Haram is the problem that it is today. If you can govern and manage your countries and provide development, that is the best antidote over the long term to terrorism.
Also, George, you said something very interesting when you're defining terrorism. And you also spoke about colonialism. So would you also say that colonialism was a form of terrorism?
It was, colonialism happened in an entirely different time period. It's almost difficult to put ourselves in the mindset of the world at that period. And there are different schools of thought. There is no doubt that the impact of colonialism has an impact to today. It has determined the process of state formation in Africa, and it has determined and condemned Africa to a poor development trajectory. But at the same time, if we want to develop, we need to look forward. We have this burden, but if you look at Vietnam, even China, they remember where they come from, but they set out a path where they want to go, and that is, in a sense, where we have to go. So we can speak at length about the evils and the oppression of colonialism and the terrorism that was associated with it and the suppression and the deaths. But we also need to look forward. And I think that looking forward is really where we go back to Agenda 2063, the South African National Development Plan. How do we take our societies forward and create an inclusive development agenda that will look after our people and develop them?
And if you have to use Vietnam as a catalyst maybe and say what is it right that they've done and what is right they're doing now, and what can we copy as the African continent from the countries like Vietnam, because really they do come from a very terrible time where some of these countries had the atomic bomb that the country was actually shaped to pieces.
This is dangerous territory because one of the major lessons, as a South African, one of the major lessons to Vietnam has been low wages and just attracting manufacturing and allowing their people to get jobs, but very lowly paid jobs and working in very difficult circumstances. This is anathema to South Africa at the moment. We have a strong labour relations framework and a strong labour movement, and the South Africa, and because of the exploitation of workers in South Africa historically, the South African government is not keen to pursue that path, but also being part of global value change. But the Vietnamese government and the government of all the so-called Asian tigers take an unrelenting focus on what they need to do to achieve growth. Now, what is interesting is that those countries achieved their major growth curve under authoritarianism. It was known as the authoritarian developmental model. China is still in that model, but at some point you grow out of that model. In South Africa, in Africa, democratization has in a sense preceded development. There are a number of African countries that still follow a kind of a authoritarian developmental model, but we have to grow and democratize at the same time generally in Africa. The democratic genie is out of the bottle, and you can't put him back, unfortunately, or for whatever your many African leaders would like to put it back and sort of say, no, we need to develop, let's leave this democracy, human rights stuff for later. You can't, not in today's connected world, and African governments don't have the agency to be able to sort of say this is the path that we want to follow. So this is one of the difficulties. We have to democratize in an interconnected, globalized world in parallel with trying to develop our society. These are huge challenges. They're very difficult to manage. Much more difficult than if you were an authoritarian China or Vietnam or Singapore, and you could say, guys, this is our industrial development policy, and this is what we are going to follow, and Africa can't work that way, and this presents elected leaders in Africa with huge challenges, given the levels of poverty and exclusion.
Because we are, in a sense, from these authoritarian regimes, so that we can't go back there and say, because we want to boom like your Asian tigers, and that we have to copy the model exactly as it is.
We're in a different historical time period. In the 70s, 80s, when the Asian development miracle happened and took off, they didn't have the extent of globalization, interconnectedness that we had. What we had in Africa after decolonialization is we had a period where African leaders often just simply copied what the colonialists did for a whole generation. We had development going backward. All our indicators were going downwards. Poverty was increasing. So it was in reaction to that Africans and Africa's international partners said, well, maybe I'm simplifying a long story, but maybe what we need is greater accountability, democracy. And ordinary Africans, that's what they want. That's what they demand. They are saying, we don't trust our government. Because if we look back at the history of our government since the 1960s, whichever time the specific African government became independent, it didn't deliver. In actual fact, things got worse. And it was the president and his son and his daughter and a few others, and there's still a number of African countries like that benefited themselves.
It becomes like a dynasty.
Yeah, and we have a number of dynasties still in Africa. So that's why I make the point that to hold this excesses of some of our leadership in check, it is only really democracy, accountability, an African variant of that can take us forward. And That's why democracy, development, growth are one and the same challenge. It's not; these are not separate issues, and it makes the management of Africa, of African countries, very difficult.
We've seen African leaders saying that, all right, now since we're going forward as Africa, and we're saying that we want to develop, and then we are inviting everybody to come in and help us with our infrastructure development. African leaders are saying, but this time we want to do it at a partnership level, not that you just donating to us and then dictating to us, but is this real? Because we have in some countries in the West Africa, where we hear that they're still using their currencies is still based in France and things like that. Are we really going into a partnership, or is it still the same story where Africa will still be dictated upon?
Africa is a continent, and individual African countries are weak internationally. That is just the reality. And we will remain, we've simply recently released a study on where Africa is going globally and so on. So Africa remains challenged. But the fact that there now is, we trade with the West, but there's also China and India and Turkey and others coming, gives us options. We have choice. We have greater agency. And that is what has changed. So we are still relatively marginal, but the difference is we don't have one set of partners who, sometimes with the best of intentions, say, but we will help you, but on our terms. And then you have to do this and you have to do that, and so on and so forth. So this change in the global dimensions is hugely important for Africa. China is now Africa's largest trading partner, but China is interested in China primarily. And it's important not to get lost in suddenly China and India, Turkey and others, they see Africa as an opportunity for growth.
They are just suddenly friends of Africa.
I mean, China has got a long history of friendship with Africa. I don't want to take that away from China, but so has many other countries. The point is simply we need to accept that only Africans have Africa's real interests in the heart, and we need to look at our own interests. And what we do at home is really the most important thing for what will happen in the medium to long term on the decisions that determine our future. And the global competition, the global interconnected world provides us with the ability to exercise greater flexibility. But it doesn't mean that we need to remember that everybody comes to the party with his or her interests. And as China grows, as China becomes more powerful, its interests will also change. And I think that in 20, 30 years' time, China will probably not be that different from the United States today in terms of how it acts. Because, power does strange things to people.
And now also, let's look into now regional integration. Because sometimes we hear African countries battling with standardization, for instance. So how easy is it going to take Africa to integrate in all spheres of integration, of course?
We spoke a little bit about the Africa Union earlier, and I made the point that it's very good at norm setting. Africa has got no absence of big plans and ambitions to integrate, but very often the real changes happen at a much lower level. There have been many efforts to integrate Africa, for example, but over time, our leaders have realized that you can't integrate because the infrastructure to integrate does not exist. We can't trade with one another because all the trading routes were originally developed under colonialism to export our materials, and our leaders have not invested in building infrastructure. So we now have what we refer to as infrastructure-led integration. Let's first build the infrastructure. And over time, the trade will happen and the impetus for regional integration will also happen. And that, I think, is entirely correct. I think that all these great schemes of top-down regional integration are important to have the vision, but to make that happen, we need to enhance trade. Africa trades at about 12% of our traders with one another, which is minuscule compared to any other region in the world. So building the infrastructure and then moving forward, I think, is the right way to go. My personal view is that regional integration will probably more happen at the sub-regional level than at the continental level. the history of the world tells us that consolidated consolidated governments are willing to give some sovereignty away to integrate. Africans are saying weak African governments will give sovereignty away, but they never do. In actual fact, all the regional integration schemes are not really working because the individual countries are still struggling to control their space and their territory. But it's going to be a messy process, but regional integration for Africa is crucial. If we do not integrate, we will remain marginal. Only economic and political integration in Africa provides a long-term viable future for Africa. We don't have the big enough markets, for example, to be part of the global economy. So it's very important.
Mm-hmm. And then also we see some regions as well where they've actually trying to open their borders and have one visa system like the European Union. Mm-hmm. Is it too soon for Africa to do that?
It depends on the region. South Africa, through the xenophobic riots, for example, is particularly affected by this issue at the moment. But the reason is GDP per capita in South Africa is 33 times higher than it is in the DRC. People are leaving Africa to go to Europe because Europe seems so rich. Well, it is rich compared to the rest of Africa. And while those disparities exist, we can speak at length about the desire for African integration and that we are all Africans and blah, 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 until they take your job away. Foreigners come in. It's a difficult issue to manage. I don't think it is, in the case, for example, of South Africa, in Southern Africa, it's really difficult to manage. We can't just open our borders. Our labor unions in South Africa will go through the roof because they are there to protect South African laborers and workers, and suddenly if everybody comes into the country, you'll have all kinds of... These are the realities. They may not be politically nice realities. That's a different tradition, and we have in South Africa a tradition of population control and border control, and also in Southern Africa, which you don't have in the rest of Africa. For example, in West Africa, populations move, their border control is quite soft. It's a different tradition. So it's region and country specific and historically specific. I think as a South African, South Africa will struggle to open up its borders. It can open up its borders for regulated population movement. And in particular, we need skills. Yeah. And at the moment, what South Africa does, it keeps everybody out, literally. It keeps unskilled people out and it keeps skilled people out, which is, I think, quite short-sighted in the South African context. But there are political reasons for that, I think.
And also now let's look into gender, because I think it's one of the very important issues in the African continent where we still have countries where women literally are not recognized. They can't even own land. And also we're talking about this vision of going forward, but then are we addressing the issue of gender in the African continent to the level that we're supposed to be?
No, we're not. We're not doing too badly in certain countries, but in general, I think there's great scope for additional progress. Again, all the studies we do, it shows you very clearly if you, and I think we all know these, if you invest in women, you invest in the future. If if you invest in female education, if you invest in female business, it had all kinds of positive spin-offs on the economy as a whole and also on social cohesion. So this issue of gender empowerment, it's not just a nice to have. It's not just a politically correct statement. It is the result of very hard-nosed economic and other analysis that shows what are the advantages. That also means that we need to move forward in difficult areas, areas that relate to so-called traditional values, where women are not always, but it differs from tradition to tradition and so on, not always treated equitably, as well as it deals with issues of religion. These are very high. I'm raising two very controversial issues, but the rest of the world has advanced to a degree. But I think we can in certain areas, we can really invest more. And in South Africa, unfortunately, I think we've slipped back a little bit in the last few years in terms of, if you look, for example, what's happened with the ANC Youth Women's League and so on, women's issues are not being driven to the extent that they used to be driven in South Africa.
But when you have the 50-50 parity, but if you South Africa in that regard, would you say that at least
we're doing better than most? I mean, we also need to pat ourselves on the back. But we need to be careful that we don't slip back. I think South Africa, the focus is there, and in certain other countries like Rwanda and so on and so forth, there's good progress. But it's one of these issues that you'll never literally be able to make enough, to say you've done enough. Because if you look at what happens in terms of your labour market, you look at who owns the companies and who's in parliament and who runs the executive. Even in South Africa, it's still very heavily male-dominated, and these issues need to change.
And then also South Africa gets accused most of the time, not maybe engaging with countries who still, criminalize gay people. Mm-hmm. And South Africa has been accused that why are you silent when Uganda, for instance, sentences the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. In that regard, how can South Africa actually deal with such situations? Because these countries are sovereign, of course.
They are, but it's the same issue with the visa of the Dalai Lama, and that is that very often national interests and politics take precedent over the principle. And this is one of the issues that I think we have in South Africa, that we have a very forward-looking, liberal and developed constitution and Bill of Rights. But South Africa, many Africans, ordinary Africans, not governments, argue that South Africa does not adhere to those values in its engagement elsewhere on the continent. It always takes liberation era solidarity above democracy and human rights. It always takes stability above democracy. And these are difficult choices to make in the real world. It's easy for me to sit in my office as a member of a think tank and to criticize. It's a very difficult choice when events blow up in Burundi or wherever, Sudan, and we then come there with a principled approach. And South Africa has often been accused that we come to every problem with the same solution, and this is I think it's less the case today. But the sort of let's talk, let's bring everybody together, and sort of the South African CODESA kind of approach. It's less of an issue today than it used to be, but it remains an issue that sometimes the South Africans come with a very inclusive solution, but yet when the rubber hits the road, they in actual fact take decisions that tend to err on the side of stability and solidarity.
What can ordinary Africans, for instance, remember that this month is Africa Month and we're celebrating Africa Month on the 25th of May. So what can we ordinary Africans as well chip in, who's always seeing to our governments that they're the ones who actually need to lead us, of course, but also as individuals.
Are you speaking South Africa or generally?
In general, Africans in general. I mean, also South Africa, of course, starting off with South Africa, because we're always accused that we sort of behave as if we are not part of the continent.
Well, for many years under apartheid, South Africa was not really part of Africa. And those barriers that were built up under apartheid still have a bit of attraction today. And one of the reasons why South Africa sometimes is seen to be acting a little bit superior, because in actual fact many South Africans don't know Africa, and haven't experienced the rest of the continent. The only people that they experience are foreigners that are coming into South Africa that are often poorly educated and take away their jobs, or so they argue. So South Africa certainly has particularly unique challenges in this, but I think the most important thing for ordinary Africans are really to hold, as a civil society person, to hold their governments to account, to participate responsibly in electing their governments and participating in public space, and to deal with issues of impropriety as appropriate. And I speak to the issues of governance because that's the easiest. Those are where Africans can make a difference. If we don't take responsibility for our own political future, we can't complain if others if things don't happen as we would like them to be.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you very much.